All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, which is coming at a pretty opportune moment as we just received the Michigan executive order regarding businesses, critical infrastructure, other stay-in-place measures. We've got a group of us here who have been digesting that order and starting to make decisions about what would be the best sort of way to step forward as a business with this executive order, certain designations and letters to have in place, other next steps. So we're going to spend a lot of our time on this Michigan order, and we'll also touch a little bit on the other stay-in-place or shelter-in-place orders that are in the other states. Let me get going with an introduction of who all is joining us on this webinar. We've got Jim Peterson, Steve van Stempvoort, and myself, Amy Murphy. I'll give everyone a chance to say hello.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, everyone. This is Steve van Stempvoort, and as Amy mentioned, it's a very opportune time for us, so I'm glad that we can have this conversation.
All right, so we're going to jump right in. I'll tell you that before the Michigan order was out, our plan had been to delve a little bit into each state's order and talk about ways they were similar and different, all in an effort to predict what was going to happen in Michigan. Now we have the Michigan order, and that seems to be the priority of the day for many of our clients. So we're going to shift away from everything we had really planned to talk about and focus first on Michigan. So the Michigan executive order, which many of you on this line, I'm sure, have at least taken a brief look at, is now available and available to the public. You can take a look at that order and try to make sense of, whether your business fits the definition of critical infrastructure. I think it's important that we go through at a high level the steps you want to be taking when you're first looking at that order. Steve, do you want to describe what we are advising our businesses, our clients, and our business community do as sort of their initial high-level steps?
Well, so thanks, Amy. Let me start just quickly with when this thing goes into effect. It goes into effect March 24, 2020 at 12:01 a.m. So that is midnight tonight for those who are counting. And it's going to continue, at least according to the current order, until April 13th, 2020. So we've got a solid couple of weeks here where this is in order. The order also explains that it may be reevaluated from time to time. So obviously we are going to keep a very close eye on that. As far as kind of the high level takeaways from what this order does, essentially it's a shelter-in-place order that indicates that everybody must work at home except for workers who are necessary to sustain or protect life, as that is defined in the order, and then also workers who are necessary to conduct minimum basic operations. So in terms of preparing or responding to this particular order, a couple decisions need to be made high level. First of all, what folks need to do, what businesses need to do, is we've got to figure out whether we are in either of these categories. So the workers who are necessary to conduct minimum basic operations, that applies to all businesses. You are allowed to keep folks who are necessary to maintain your inventory, et cetera, as explained in the order. So, and then there's a subset of other businesses, these businesses that are necessary to sustain or protect life. These are the essential businesses that are permitted to remain open under the order. And this is really the kind of the key category about whether folks can continue to operate. So in order to first of all kind of assess how this is going to apply to you, first you need to figure out, is my business in a critical infrastructure sector as defined by the order? And then if so, you need to designate your critical workers. That can be done orally for now, but it has to be done in writing by March 31. And the goal here is the order requires employers to limit the in-person workers as much as possible. So you have to designate which workers are going to be critical for your business. And then third, you need to designate your necessary suppliers. Again, that can be done orally for now, but it has to be done in writing by March 31. So those are the kind of the big steps that we need to do immediately.
Thanks, Steve. And Jim, do you have some comments on that?
Sure. So I was going to add that one thing that's helpful about the order, which otherwise is more restrictive than some of the other states in the Midwest, particularly Illinois and Ohio, is the order specifically references the memorandum on identification of essential critical infrastructure workers that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security. And so that guidance from the Department of Homeland Security is actually fairly broad. And so in advising clients, we are going to be looking at that and seeing if the client's business falls within the guidance by the Department of Homeland Security. I frankly think that the state of Michigan wants to be more restrictive, but they have referenced this, and the federal government has given guidance which I think will allow a lot of our clients to continue operations.
And Jim, can you talk a little bit about the critical infrastructure list developed by the Department of Homeland Security in terms of how broadly can we read these categories? How much play in the joints is there for clients who at least seem to tick off some of the categories in that list, or if they don't themselves fit in the list, might supply to a business that fits under that list?
Right. So the federal government has identified 16 sectors that they categorize as essential critical infrastructure for our country. And because those sectors encompass so much, I actually think that it's fairly broad, and that because our clients are involved in the supply chain, even if they don't necessarily fit within the top of the supply chain, they are critical and key suppliers for those. And so they can expect to be, if they haven't already, receiving letters from their customers saying, we need you to continue operations. And you know, the interesting thing about the federal guidance is it not only allows operations to continue, it states that companies involved in the critical infrastructure industry have a special responsibility to maintain normal work schedules.
Jim, one other question, because it's already coming across in our Q&A wire that we've got going. Let's say a business tells one of our clients that their business is essential.
Yes.
Then what does the client do with that determination by their client?
So they can then operate under the governor's order. They should ask for that designation to be put in writing as well, because the order requires that. But then they can also designate their employees as critical infrastructure workers. They can do that orally for now, and no later than March 31 at 11:59 p.m., they'll have to have a writing making that designation. It can even be something as simple as an email. We have a team here that's working on preparing those communications that our clients can send to their employees and also to their suppliers.
And let me follow up on that, Amy, because those individuals, those clients who have received a letter designating them as a supplier, they can in turn submit letters to their own suppliers, passing that along the chain. So you designate your own suppliers as critical infrastructure suppliers as well, and then the process is repeated.
Right, so the web of entities that become part of the critical infrastructure definition gets bigger as you think about not only your employees, but your suppliers who are necessary to maintain your business. We talk a little bit more about this sort of documentation. We think it would be best for clients to have at hand in case there is any effort by the state to enforce this order, either by knocking on your business's door or stopping one of your employees as they're walking into your facility?
Sure. So one of the things that we've been doing for clients with facilities in other states that have similar orders in place is we've been preparing an opinion letter for them, which determines, based on an analysis of their business, that they are, in our opinion, a critical infrastructure industry under the guidance of the Department of Homeland Security and fall within an exemption of the state executive orders. We've also prepared communications that those companies can provide to their employees, which do a couple things. First of all, they generate some comfort among your employees that their role really is essential and that they are critical infrastructure workers, and so they should feel good about the fact that they are continuing work. The other thing that we've done is create a communication that employees can actually carry with them so that as they travel to, from, and in the course of employment, they can show that to law enforcement officials if they're pulled over and asked why they are out instead of observing the restrictions under the stay-at-home orders. And then we've also drafted communications to suppliers which designate them as key suppliers for a critical infrastructure industry.
We're also getting this question, Jim. Do you need to be submitting that documentation to anyone else outside of the clients, giving it to your employees, giving it to your suppliers? Does it need to go to the state?
It actually does not, right? There's no provision in the order which requires some application to be submitted, which is positive, because I can't imagine the delay that would cause in trying to get a response from the government that's overwhelmed at this time. So really, there is nothing more. You ought to just have an opinion from council saying that you are a critical infrastructure business or that you're otherwise exempt from the stay-at-home provisions of the governor's order. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is just what the enforcement mechanisms are, right? And that's at the very end of the order, and it talks about, consistent with Michigan statutes, a willful violation of this order is a misdemeanor, right? So it is a crime, but it's got to be a willful violation of the order. And we believe that clients who have a good faith opinion that they fall within critical infrastructure under the Department of Homeland Security guidance will not be charged with a willful violation of that order.
And frankly, enforcement is really a big question here. We're not sure who's going to be tasked with enforcing this or how that's going to be done or how those determinations are going to be made. So
here's another question that I think we're seeing our clients asking this question. What about, if your employees are able to work remotely, does this order affect you at all?
So the order actually encourages you to have employees work from home to the greatest extent possible. One interesting thing about the order is that it takes a different approach from some of the other states, which in essence said, you should construe this order broadly in order to continue normal operations. Michigan takes the reverse approach and actually in the first provision says this order must be construed broadly to prohibit in-person work that is not necessary to sustain or protect life. So as a result of that, I think that clients are better off if they can have workers work remotely, they should do that. And it's only those workers who are essential in order to conduct the business operations that they should have on site. So there certainly is a kind of a presumption that if you can work remotely, you should be working remotely.
And if you're going through this analysis of deciding, okay, we fit within a category of critical infrastructure, now we have to turn to, as Steve said, figuring out who in our staff is critical infrastructure worker and who is not, that could be a determination of, if there are folks who could be working remotely, then they could, you could send them to work remotely from their homes. And then you're sort of left with a smaller population of staff. And the determination at that point is, are they critical? Are they necessary for your business to operate? If so, designating them will, and doing so within a week or so by writing, will help to make sure your employees can get to work and do the essential work that needs to be done.
That's true, because the order does provide that businesses maintaining in-person activities, first of all, must adopt the social distancing practices and other mitigation measures to protect the workers. And those include restricting the number of workers present on premises to no more than is strictly necessary to perform the businesses or operations' critical infrastructure functions, and promoting remote work to the fullest extent possible. And then, obviously the social distancing guidelines and other recommendations from the CDC are to be followed as well.
We're already about halfway through the webinar, so I want to pause here and talk about maybe some of the high level discussions we've been having about certain industries that impact our clients. Jim, what industries have you been looking at this morning in regard to the DHS critical infrastructure list?
So I've looked at this morning manufacturing companies primarily, and those manufacturing companies we have concluded fall comfortably within the Department of Homeland Security guidance. One was an automotive supplier, and the Department of Homeland Security has involved the transportation systems sector as critical infrastructure, and it's also mentioned in the governor's order, the transportation and logistics sector. And we've also consulted with clients in the manufacturing that supports the construction industry, right? And although the construction industry is not specifically called out in the governor's order, it is specifically called out in the memorandum on identification of essential critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security. And not necessarily by particular workers, but the very first page of that guidance references working construction. And so we've said that those manufacturers should continue operations because they are key to the sectors that the department has identified.
Steve, what are some of the industries you've been looking at this morning?
Same, manufacturers, a lot of them fall within the supply chain at minimum. So whether they're directly fall within one of the categories that has been identified as one of the 16 critical infrastructure categories or not, many manufacturers fall within the supply chain somewhere. And so that is basis either for either for categorization as one of the critical infrastructure sectors, industries, or as a supplier thereof. Again, a lot of the other ones there have been some financial services, banks, credit unions. Those also fall within the critical infrastructure. Again, the guidelines for the executive order would require that in-person presence at those different banks or financial institutions would be minimized, but they would certainly be critical infrastructure as well.
A couple of other industries that we've been fielding questions on are agriculture, healthcare, and defense. So agriculture is listed as a category in the critical infrastructure list of the Department of Health and Human Services. If you've got farms, employees who supply to farms, we think you're fitting comfortably within that food and agriculture category. Healthcare is a big one. Jim and Steve, have either of you dealt with a healthcare question yet?
So I've dealt with companies that support the healthcare industry. I mean, they might manufacture medical devices or medical equipment. Those are clearly covered by the guidance and also by the governor's order.
Yeah, particularly with respect to some of these well, hospitals, of course, healthcare workers, frontline workers, of course, they are critical infrastructure. In fact, the order allows them not even to be designated. So if you are a healthcare, if you're in the healthcare sector, you don't have to designate your workers because they all automatically essentially get to be at work. Some questions arise about elective practices that provide elective surgeries. Those are, again, healthcare workers broadly are in critical infrastructure. And so those folks would be critical infrastructure worker. However, obviously pertinent to other executive orders, some of those elective surgeries, et cetera, have been shut down, but they would still be counted as critical infrastructure workers.
One other industry, and I highlighted it about a minute ago, is what we would say are the defense industry. So if your company is performing under a contract with the Department of Defense, if your company provides services to meet the federal government's national security commitments, you're going to be covered under the DHS critical infrastructure list, and therefore under Michigan's order, you would be critical infrastructure that should continue to operate during the pandemic.
That's true, and the Department of Defense has been issuing letters already to their contractors.
Amy, one other industry that I've been fielding questions from is folks in the transportation and logistics industry. That again is a critical infrastructure sector. And a lot of the questions are coming from suppliers downstream. And again, I think the best advice we can give there is that many of them would fall within the critical infrastructure sector of transportation and logistics, even if they are somewhat downstream or upstream if they're suppliers.
So we're getting a lot of requests for written opinions from clients and the communications to provide to suppliers, employees, and the appropriate designations. And we're fielding those and we're prioritizing them. And so we are tracking those to make sure we get all those communications out to clients. So I just wanted to make sure clients knew that if they thought a letter like that would be beneficial and wanted those designations, they can contact any one of us, or even just Miller Johnson generally in our marketing department, and we'll be fielding those requests and complying with what the clients need as quickly as we can. And I want to add to that because we've been doing this with all the other state orders, we've looked at the Department of Homeland Security guidance, and we're fielding a lot of common questions from clients in common industries. And so we're able to efficiently and cost effectively create these communications and provide them to clients.
That's helpful, Jim. And so you can find, if you don't already have an email address of a Miller Johnson attorney to contact who will loop you into to our team here, you can email any of the three of us. Our email addresses are on the Miller Johnson website. For Jim Peterson, Steve van Stempvoort, and myself, Amy Murphy. And we will make sure you get what you need so that you can step forward with this order, stay in business, get your employees set up with the documentation they need to be attending work. If you, let's talk for a moment about businesses who are operating in several states. Because there are different state orders. Jim, can you speak at a high level about what our businesses who have to think about not just Michigan's order, but what's going on around the country right now? What steps do they need to be taking?
Right. So the fortunate thing is that most of the state's executive orders specifically reference the Department of Homeland Security guidance. And so, if you comply with one state's order, the likelihood is that you will be in compliance with the other orders as well. Even Pennsylvania, which initially issued an executive order that did not incorporate that guidance, has since revised its order to incorporate that. And so as a result of that, we've been looking primarily at the federal guidance on these issues and advising clients, but we've been tailoring the opinion letters that we've done to the appropriate executive orders. The interesting thing is the executive orders started from local governmental entities, right? It was the Bay Area, California, counties and the departments of public health, which were issuing, I believe, the first orders, and now they tend to be more statewide, although I saw this morning that Dallas County in Texas had issued its own order as well, and it came from a judge as opposed to someone in the executive branch.
And Jim, some of these states have a waiver process in place. Does Michigan's have a waiver process? And if you're working in a state where there is a waiver process, what should a client be thinking about as they review that part of the executive order?
Right. So Michigan, first of all, does not have a waiver application process. Pennsylvania, for example, does have a waiver application process. I have been advising clients that it is better to get an opinion letter from counsel that they can rely on in good faith rather than applying for a waiver, because who knows how long a decision on the waiver could be. And I think under the federal guidance, our clients with operations in Pennsylvania can in good faith say, we've been encouraged to maintain normal operations. We sought advice of counsel. We believe we're critical infrastructure under the federal guidance. And as a result of that, we are going to continue operations. And then to the extent that there are enforcement procedures undertaken, we can deal with those as they come.
Steve, we're getting a question pretty frequently from our clients on this one. So let's say that your client's business meets the definition of critical infrastructure. And at this point, the client has gone through the process of designating the employees. We're going back to the Michigan order now, folks. You've designated your employees who are critical infrastructure workers and your suppliers who are critical to your business. And now the question becomes, how do we operate our business in compliance with this order, especially the provisions relating to social distancing and other practices to mitigate the possibility of transmission of COVID-19?
Yeah, so the order does lay out several sorts of activities, ways that you have to conduct your business, and they're laid out actually in the order. You have to promote remote work as much as possible, keep the number of physically present employees down to the minimum, enact those social distancing standards that have been issued by the CDC. Keep workers' patrons 6 feet apart. Make sure that you are hypervigilant about maintaining clean premises. So those are the things that you have to do to operate your businesses in that consistent with the executive order. Those are laid out with some detail in the executive order itself.
So the tricky thing that we'll be seeing, I assume, with many of our, especially in the manufacturing world, is a line where it's pretty difficult to comply with these provisions. And unfortunately, the order lays them out in the level of detail that I think demands us to at least try, to get your lines, your assembly in such a way that employees can be standing 6 feet apart. And take other steps to keep your facilities clean and encourage employees who are experiencing respiratory symptoms from not coming in. Does that sound right, Steve?
Yeah, and I mean, the order says, that these guidelines have to be complied with to the maximum extent possible. That's a quote. So to the extent that it is possible to do so, then again, you should try. There is a real legitimate question about enforcement as well. I mean, is somebody going to be looking over your shoulder on the shop floor? Unlikely.
We are getting many, many questions. And unfortunately, our time on this webinar is up. So again, we've got our names across the presentation. If you're looking at this on your computer, you can contact any of the three of us to discuss getting your business the documentation and analysis that you need to keep your business moving forward. Any final thoughts from you, Jim or Steve?
No, really none. And thank you for participating on this. And this is something that I think looks worse at first blush than it actually is. And so I would encourage people not to overreact. We've got a team working on this, and we'll be prepared to answer any questions that you have.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that under this order, there will be many, many businesses that can continue operations, perhaps with a reduced number of physical employees. But I do think that there is a significant opportunity to maintain and continue operations here.
So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll look forward to working with you as you field questions and get your businesses on the right foot.